Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, How to Engage an Isolated and Remote Workforce with Collaborative Learning. Our presenters today are Lars Hyland, Chief Learning Officer for Totara Learning, and David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst for Brandon Hall Group. I would like to extend a thank you to Totara for sponsoring today's webinar. And let's learn a little bit more about Totara. So Totara builds employee engagement, learning, and performance management technologies that enable large multinational corporations, government entities, and mid-market companies to deliver enterprise-level talent and workforce experiences. Totara's talent experience platform unifies a transformational learning management system, a user-centric learning experience platform, and a comprehensive performance management system under a single and highly adaptable architecture. Totara's flexible architecture gives organizations the freedom to innovate, the freedom to choose, and unlocks critical resources for reinvestment into where it really counts. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group is a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. Just a quick mention that our Excellence Awards program is now open for submissions, and we have added about a dozen categories across multiple program areas, so please be sure to visit our website for the latest. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components for our research, so if you have a few minutes and see any topics that you're interested in partaking in, please visit our website, and all participants receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And finally, a few logistics. The presentation is being recorded. Playback and slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters. If you would like to download a copy of the presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section on your control panel. And without further delay, I will turn it over to Dave so we can get started.
Great, thank you, Melissa, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And I was leaving this up here for a moment for you to get familiar with where that question box is. Both Lars and I will try to answer any relevant questions that come in real time so we can have an ongoing dialogue. We'll save some time at the end as well to catch any we may have missed or any new questions, but feel free to ask questions as we go through to make sure that we hear what you're saying, and we'll try to answer your questions as they come. So thanks for that. And with that, so let's get started talking about today's topic. And obviously, what we want to start to dig into is the impact that this pandemic has had on organizations. Now, obviously, this isn't news to folks on the call. You've been dealing with this for a year, give or take, and you're probably acutely aware of the impact on your own organization. But we want to look at it from sort of a bigger picture standpoint and what impact that has on how we manage the employee experience as well as learning and development moving forward. So one of the key things is that this remote work pendulum has swung obviously completely far to one side, where as the lockdowns began and stay-at-home orders were issued and people just for their own good were staying home, obviously the percentage of remote work shot up dramatically. And what we found in our research and what we're hearing from organizations we talk to is that as the return to work strategies start to roll out and companies start to shift a little bit and vaccine becomes more widely available, we see that pendulum is not going to swing all the way back, right? So if you look here, you can see that before the pandemic, about 68% of companies said that their percentage of remote workers was a quarter or less of their workforce. So a lot of those in that very small percentage of remote workers. And of course, once the lockdown started, the pandemic really set in, those numbers shot through the roof, and you could see 51% saying it's more than 3/4 of our workforce is now remote. So a massive jump. And then we asked, okay, well, what's going to happen as things start to ease off? We start to return to work. What are we going to have? And you see that 37%. I'm sorry, 27% of companies say that they're going to go back down to that 0 to 25% of the workforce being remote. So a dramatic drop and an increase in the remote work. So the ultimate story here is that remote work is here to stay, and that really changes how organizations approach a lot of these strategies. It's not about how do we get through the next few months of remote work, right? Let's just get through this time until we can get back to whatever was normal. It's a change in strategy for the future. And one of the biggest things that hit when remote work shot through the roof is you've got a lot of people who've never really done it before, right? Organizations that don't have much experience with it. And so we did see in the early days, back March, April, May of last year, there was a big fear and some realized fear of productivity loss among the workforce that was working remotely. And companies said the biggest thing that was causing it was distractions at home, right? We had kids weren't in school, spouses and partners working together in the same house. So there's a lot of distractions in the home. And so there's all these different kinds of levers of productivity loss, but it's interesting to see things like, the managers' inexperience in managing remote workers, right? So how do we do that now that people aren't down the hall? You have the employees themselves, their lack of experience working remotely. This lack of connection between learners and managers at 29%, so that was a big cause of productivity loss. And those are the kind of things that Lars and I want to attack today and dig into is, obviously this move to a remote workforce has isolated people and has put a strain on connectivity and collaboration. We have to figure out, how do we get that back? How do we address that in this new environment? And one of the things that we saw in our research was from a leadership standpoint. And this is very important because it's all about sort of role modeling and displaying from leaders the behaviors and the approaches that the organization needs. And so we asked organizations, what are the key inclusive leadership behaviors that are being demonstrated during this period? And so these are companies that are rating this on a 4 or a 5. So, very, very highly rated, saying, yes, this is happening in our organization. You can see here, 54% of companies are saying, that the leadership collaborates inclusively and recognizes everyone. And this collaboration piece is a big chunk of what is standing out as a leadership behavior, a leadership characteristic that organizations want and need to see as they navigate their way through this. And Lars, I want to bring you in because I know that you've done some research too, looking at what's critical as far as being able for an organization and its people to adapt to this new environment.
Well, that's right. There's an enormous shift that everyone's been experiencing over the past period of time, but it does extend back over a considerable number of years if you look at the underlying trends. Yeah. And the, I think what we're seeing is that looking forward, that collaboration and the ability to communicate with each other effectively and remain productive is increasingly important. And as you say, David, we've just been reviewing the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report, which was published in October 2020, so it's fairly recent, and that's been looking forward to what they're envisaging a huge reskilling movement. I think there's one statistic which is by 2030 there's a demand to reskill 1 billion people, and that's no mean feat to do. So we're all going to need to really work hard on really building out the ability to connect with each other, to collaborate effectively, and that requires fresh skills. And there's the list on the screen right now is the top 10 skills that they determine are needed. And our own research, I think, when we look at this in the round from Totara's perspective, we're providing technology to a whole wide range of organizations around the world. And what we see is an increasing need for an ability to be flexible. So that's obviously down to individuals and people, but it's also down to the infrastructure that the organizations have and need to have in place. And I think we've seen plenty of organizations struggle with their technology choices, perhaps in the past year, particularly when it's been put under such strain and pressure. Imagine moving everybody over to remote working in a matter of days or weeks, and then realizing that you may have the tools that you're using may not stretch, may not scale, may not be understood actually enough by your people to get the best out of it and achieve that. So that may be well underpinning some of the statistics and research that you've been sharing there, David.
You know, and I think, Lars, you've really hit on it when you said that all of these things, both on this list and the things that we've been seeing in our research, these are not new, right? These are not things that suddenly popped up because of the pandemic. It's their criticality has become very clear in the wake of the pandemic. But these are things that, you know, I know my organization has been working with companies for a long time, and this type of approach. And so what this whole thing is about, it isn't about reacting to the pandemic itself. It's about, you know, what do we do moving forward? And this was a direction that most organizations were already pointed in, but for whatever reasons, were very slow to make the change. And now they've sort of been forced. And I think what's really important here is this focus on that resilience and flexibility. While that's always been a key characteristic to have in people, and especially leadership, but everybody in the organization, I think what matters now is that organizations' ideas of what flexibility really means have changed, I think is what's happened, right? When people would all have been saying for years, well, business changes very rapidly, we need to be flexible, we need to be agile to keep up with the speed of business. But in people's minds, the parameters of what that change could possibly be probably didn't include a global pandemic. And so the change, the definition of change for organizations has broadened drastically, right? So the types of things that we need to be flexible for is completely different now. And they've taken a new approach that, okay, we may have thought we were agile before, we may have thought we were flexible before, but it turns out we weren't. And so there's a new heightened focus on this. And so when you talk about this thing about reskilling and keeping people or upskilling and giving people what they need in this environment, I think what's interesting to me is we did some research specific to COVID-19, and from an L&D perspective, we were looking at, okay, the door has basically been shut on ILT for the time being. What are organizations doing instead of that? Because we know that for as long as we've been tracking this stuff, in-person classroom training has been the #1 way companies deliver training. 96% of companies do it at least to some degree, or were doing it at least to some degree. So there's a huge vacuum now, right? And that's no longer possible. So if you look, when we first asked this question, those would be the green numbers. So back in April, beginning of April, end of March, what we saw was this immediate move to, okay, if I can't have you in person, I'll take that content and I will put it up in a webinar or a virtual classroom, or we'll just have a conference call. And that's how we'll do this. And I think what happens is you see, in short order, that organizations realize that's not a viable solution, right? That in-class, in-person experience is not translatable one-to-one to a webinar or a virtual classroom. The skill set required to deliver in a virtual environment is not the same as it is to be a facilitator or an instructor in person. And so once sort of those next few months passed, you can see this shift as organizations said, okay, we're not going to do this wholesale shift from in-person to virtual. Let's explore a multitude of options. Let's look at a lot of different things. And what you'll see, and I think what's a key to what we're talking about today, is this rise in collaboration tools. Like, we need to be able to use these kind of tools for L&D, get people learning and collaborating in ways, since they can't be together in the class. How are we going to grow that? And so it becomes a very key point in the skilling and reskilling of the workforce in this environment, is the collaboration. So let's look a little bit.
David,
yeah,
just
go ahead.
On that point, actually, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that a lot of organizations have been very comfortable with classroom training.
Yes.
And there's a shared comfort between delivering it and also receiving it that comes from just tradition, really. And it isn't necessarily linked to the true effectiveness of that learning experience anyway. So so really looking at a more blended, more holistic approach with a mix of tools and experiences actually will lead to a more effective sort of transfer of skills. You're actually building capability in people much more effectively. And we should have been doing that anyway.
Precisely.
We didn't really need a pandemic necessarily to shift it, but what it has done is put into sharp relief that, just as you've said, you can't just do what you were doing and move online, because it just shows the holes, how many holes that were in that design in the first place. So this is the opportunity, I think, to think differently, think afresh. It does put more constraint on people's, or they feel it's more constraining, but actually with the right mix of tools and support, as you're listing here, you can really deliver a much more impactful learning experience. And not only that, with the collaboration elements in place, we're bringing that learning much closer to actual practice and people performing in their roles. And you know, we for too long, too many organizations have focused on the just in case type training model, as opposed to just in time, or actually sewn into the work experience. So it's a fantastic opportunity to really switch modes now going forward.
Right, and I think that's the critical part here is, you know, I'm not a proponent of there should be no ILT, right? I think sometimes in the past you've heard the death of the classroom, and you know, I do feel that it's an important part, an important piece of the puzzle. But I think this has provided organizations a chance to rethink their approach and their strategy to it. And like you said, Lars, I think we've just been doing it the way we've been doing it because that's been the bulk of how it's been done. But what you realize pretty quickly, and somebody had asked the question, why did, you know, VILT go down during the pandemic, that virtual instructor-led training, is for the reasons that I mentioned. I mean, what people don't understand is one of the things that makes ILT effective when it is effective is just the sheer fact that people are together in the same space. And you can't really quantify the engagement that creates. And you only recognize it once it's gone, and you try to recreate that in-person experience through something like a virtual classroom or a webinar, and realize that it doesn't exist anymore. And so now you're left with, okay, that's why I think you see in the short term, that's what companies went with. And then they realized, okay, this isn't working very well. How do we use a bunch of different elements to create some sort of engagement, some sort of connectivity that's now missing, right? And I think that's really the key. And like you said, Lars, these are things that we've been saying for years when we talk to companies. This is a proper direction in which to go, surely for an effectiveness reason, right? This stuff works. You know, the engagement piece, the getting people involved in the learning, getting to participate in continuous learning. So it's no longer totally event driven by classes and courses. But like I said, the pandemic has just made this all sort of crystal clear and accelerated everything greatly. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about, you know, specifically about the collaboration. Now, I'm going to share some of the results from a survey that we've just had launched here at Brandon Hall Group on team development. And I think it's important, this is a big piece of the collaboration, is we know that a lot of the work that's happening in organizations is team-based, and it has been, and it will be, and this will continue to grow. And remember, this data has been collected at the very tail end of 2020, so people were full swing into the pandemic when they were thinking about teams. And you can see, you know, what percentage of your organization's work is accomplished through teams. 30% of companies say that more than 3/4 of the work that their organization does is via teams. And you add that to the next group, 81% say it's more than half. So a vast majority of the work that's occurring is happening in teams. So teams are critical. And now we're talking about in an environment where people can't physically be together in those teams. And then we look ahead and say, how much do you think the percentage of work that's accomplished through teams, how will that change over the next year or two? And nearly 2/3 of companies say that the use of teams is going to increase. So that again puts a huge spotlight on the idea of collaboration and teamwork, and how do we work, build this in. And this has a huge connection to learning and development, because if people are going to be working in teams, clearly they should be also learning in teams and learning together, and that's the only way that we're going to be able to develop and move forward.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I think there is a whole area of investigation and design approach, which is action learning. Action learning is all about designing a learning experience around real problems and bringing people together to solve those problems and draw on learning opportunities and support materials really to sort of help that really cement it into practical experience that can be then reapplied again in the future. So teams is critical, and as you say, teams, when you're not physically together, there is something that is lost, and it needs to be replaced in some way when you are finding yourself actually on your own, but working in a virtual team of various sorts. As I think, David, you've now showing, there's a wide variety of approaches.
Right, and so and I think it's important for people to think of their organization. And I sometimes I feel like, in the conversations I have with them, that when the work is being done and being accomplished, sometimes it's so ingrained and so organic that the work is done via teams that the company doesn't think of them as teams, or doesn't formally recognize them as teams. So it's important to think about the way things happen in your organization, see if you can recognize where these types of teams exist, and you'll see all kinds of them. And obviously work teams, very specific, but we're the most traditional type of teams where they're producing goods or services. And then obviously management teams, and just so you take the work team concept and apply that to supervisors, managers, and leaders. Project teams, so these are sort of the one-off teams. They come together for specific projects, and we see this more and more where companies will pull together teams, and somebody maybe have one role on one project team, and then the next time a project team rolls around, they actually have a different role. So people have to know, be able to work in those various roles within teams. Clearly, virtual teams are going to be more and more important. This number 69% is pretty high, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that by November, December, when this survey was conducted, most teams were now virtual by default. And then parallel teams, and Lars and I talked about this a little bit. We put this in there because it's something that we see from time to time in organizations. It's not exactly commonplace or well thought of as the usual approach to teams, but it's like taking cross silo. You can think of it as a cross-functional team, but the folks are still working within their silos, doing particular work in parallel. So there's a lot of different types of teamwork at play.
There is, and this is something that we've been doing quite a lot of thinking about, how to support bringing together the right mix of people to form a team that will be complementary. They would invariably cross-functional, but do they have complementary skills and sort of personal attributes, should we say, to really be high performing? And that's just growing, I think, as a challenge for organizations as they try and understand the talent that they have inside the organization. Where is it? What are the skills they have now? And as we've just been discussing, what are the skills they really need in the future? And what are the gaps? Because then you can start to respond to that, to prepare your organization to be more adaptable and resilient going forward. But in terms of technology support, how do you facilitate bringing these people together? How do they find out about each other? How do you form work like virtual workspaces, I guess, when people come together to really solve a challenge or problem or innovate together? And these tools are, I think, are increasingly important and need to be very closely wedded into learning support and the performance management aspect of it. So when you talk about management teams, project teams, the virtual team aspect lays all the way across it, it feels, and that there'll be a lot of movement. These teams are going to be standing up, being pulled down again, almost at very short notice, just in response to the environment that we're all working in now, full of uncertainty and unpredictability.
Yeah, and to me that ties it back again to the learning and development piece of it. We spend a lot of time. Most organizations prioritize leadership development in their organization. Spend a lot of time and money and effort on that, trying to build leaders. And one of the things you constantly hear is why leadership development is so important. Is somebody could be the best at their particular role. They could be the greatest engineer, a great developer, great salesperson, and because they've been so successful in that particular role. Often they become leaders, managers, supervisors, but they might have zero leadership skills. And so you hear that all the time. It's just, because you're the best at something doesn't mean you'll be the best leader. And so they try to infuse those leadership skills into people so that they can be those kind of leaders. We need to take the same approach to teams, because you may be the best at what you do in your particular role, but you're invariably going to have to work on some sort of team for things to work together. And do you actually have those skills to collaborate? Collaboration is a skill. It's innate for a lot of people, but do you have that ability? So it's not even, obviously the technology is the huge enabler, but are we developing people to be able to work in teams? And, Lars, you brought up the technology, and I think that's an important piece, because when we looked into the research and we were asking orgs, what's going on as a result of the pandemic, does it have an impact on how you manage your teams? And 78% said yes, it's had an impact. We've had to bring new technologies in-house to make sure that the teams are connected and can work together. Only 2% said, look, the pandemic has disrupted things so much that we've had to actually dismantle the teams because they can't work together. So, I mean, granted, that's a very low number, thankfully. But again, that would fall to me into the bucket of, if they had the right technologies in place, they could probably sustain those teams. But you see 20% did have the technology already in-house, and they were using that. I mean, look, we're talking about Teams. Microsoft has a platform called Teams that a lot of organizations use to keep people connected. But there's more there, and it's not just about the communication aspect. It's about the learning, the development, the skills, and how we're building that and allowing people to collaborate in that sort of environment. So we want to talk about how do we foster collaboration within the organization. So to me, I think it's really important to talk about this, because in all the research that we do, we talk to hundreds and hundreds of organizations every year, walking through these things. We have our award-winning case studies in our library that of great examples of companies doing these things. And so what we found is, when it comes to that employee experience, we had distilled it down to these different categories, right? The critical elements of that experience, and as well as what goes into meaningful work. And if you look, you'll see that this stuff pops up time and time again, right? So the peer interaction and collaboration, manager interaction and collaboration, two big chunks of the critical elements of the overall employee experience. Those come up all the time as key pillars of that experience. And then when you talk about what makes meaningful work, we've found that in that set of things that is meaningful work, collaboration is one of those elements. So this is a critical thing that organizations need to focus on and figure out. And I want to turn to you, Lars, to talk a little bit more specifically about employees and sort of their priorities when it comes to collaboration in their work.
Yes, indeed, and I think this just reinforces what you've found, and what plenty of research has seen, is that there's been this shift of priorities over a considerable time, I'd say, but it's come into really sharp focus over the past 2-3 years. I think is that our sense of priorities as workers working for organizations is that it's really shifted from a real strong focus on the job. And to be fair, there's plenty of people where right now we're all in a situation where you might be one step away from, or worried about losing a job. So I'm not playing that down, but in more stable times, we are sort of seeing that people want to work, but also balance it carefully with the rest of their life. And that's become even more sharply focused as we've been thrown into our homes and bedrooms, and it's become offices for ourselves, and it's stomped heavily onto our lives. And how do we make that separate, or how do we separate that out? How do we navigate that transition? So that's a real critical issue, and it's become, and just picking up one of the earlier bits of research that you showed, I think the top priority was people's well-being and sense of mental health, and really concerned about people. That is really critical to this. So going forward, we shouldn't lose sight of that, because what motivates us in the workplace is underpins these shifts. So I want to have balance in my life. I want to be able to build on my strengths. I want to be able to work with complementary people. That comes down to collaboration. And yes, I may have some weaknesses, but it really is about plugging in and working collaboratively together in as high performing teams and really be able to exercise what comes easy to you perhaps, and maybe very hard for others. And that sense of moving from a hierarchical model where I'm being told what to do by a manager, and now it's more a case of being mentored and coached and guided in what I do, and there's a more fluid two-way communication that needs to be supported. So that's a feedback and check-in mechanism is increasingly important. And as I think everyone is just really strongly realizing, either because they have had to change roles, so they've lost a role and been trying to find another role, and finding out that their current skills maybe aren't as employable as they thought, there is a real pressure to focus on your own learning and development and to take much more ownership over it, which when you're looking at the effectiveness of any learning and development activity, then that ownership has to be there. It has to be, that motivation has to be there. Right now we've got a very powerful extrinsic motivation to do it, where we're needing to find new jobs and roles maybe imminently in the years ahead, because the current roles that we occupy now are under threat, either by technology or by economic shifts and changes. So looking forward into, if we look at what those disruptors are, when you look at what's underpinning the shifts that we're seeing, well, clearly technology is impacting pretty much every sector. It doesn't matter where you're working now, your business is turning and transforming into a digital business in some respects, either through automation or through other applications of technology, which is making your supply chains, all of your processes more efficient. And the nature of the roles there are quite fundamentally going to change in many areas. But if you're an established large company, then turning that ship, in what is now very tangible speed of change, just this past year, I think has really made us understand what exponential change is about, and the impact of technology is only going to accelerate that further this year and onwards. So that's a key thing that we need to grapple with, and that's about collaborating in flexible ways with others. And we've already talked about remote work. Working from home is no longer seen as a perk. If anything, it's seen as a may have switched around in people's perceptions. We're desperate to reconnect in many regards with others, but differently. I think going forward, the role of the office space is going to definitely change quite significantly. And also our definition of what a workforce is. So we tend to think that they're employees working full-time or part-time for an organization, but actually a blended workforce is becoming more prevalent, where we've got this gray area between being employed or actually not being fully employed. You're part of maybe a freelance or contracting community. You may be a micro business being set up. There's been unprecedented levels of shift there over the past 12-18 months. So thinking about your organization not just as your employees, but your whole reseller network, your supply chain, as an extended enterprise, that actually influences the type of support that you need to give those people. You need to provide learning and education to keep everybody aligned, because effectively that whole continuum needs to collaborate effectively across not just silos, but literally across in and outside of organizational structures. And we've already touched on reskilling, a challenge that lies ahead. That cannot be underestimated. So it's something that we do need to look very carefully inside our organizations and have the means by which we can audit, look at the skills that we have and who has them, and you may well find they're in surprising places, and then facilitate much more freedom of movement to face off to the new challenges that your organization will have as a result of all of these disruptors together. So if we just want to move on
Yeah, and as we go, that the reskilling element is so critical, and especially as you put it here, that reskilling so that people stay relevant. The huge challenge, and then we see it in our research, organizations don't know what skills they should be developing for the near future. They're challenged by that. They haven't even identified. So it's a big thing. It isn't just about, oh, we know what we need, so let's develop those skills. That step has to be taken of, what is it that we do need? And it isn't necessarily about creating, a hard and fast laundry list of skills, but it's about, the things that Lars was talking about earlier, the adaptability, the flexibility. It's about creating a strategy that is adaptable and flexible so that you can change what those skills will be as time goes by, because they will change. And that's what usually stops companies in their tracks, is they think, well, things are going to change too rapidly for me to even bother. But the idea is to set a framework in place for reskilling and upskilling that is flexible enough to keep up.
That's right. And so what all of this builds towards, I think, is building, I think McKinsey, but others call it an intentional learning culture. So what that essentially means is that you're building the systems, the processes, the expectation, and the culture that I'm always learning, and I'm always looking for better ways to do what I'm doing. I'm open to feedback and change. I'm open to doing things in different ways, and that whole mindset means that you can be much more flexible and adaptable going forward, and collectively as an organization you'll find that you are. And then just picking up on your point, David, about reskilling, is having the means to allow people to sort of show what they know, and not be constrained in perhaps the current job role they are in or the project they're on, but there's a mechanism by which they can exercise what they already know in other areas and actually be recognized for that, actually support people across right across the business. And that's how you spot talent, which you may find in surprising places in your organization, which I think is quite critical, especially when an organization may be under stress overall and is looking to make, say, cuts. You may inadvertently lose some fantastic talent if you don't have that visibility available to you.
Right, and without that visibility, organizations feel like they have to hire their way out of these challenges, and we know how sort of untenable and expensive a proposition that can be.
Absolutely. There's big gains, I think, to be had by focusing on what that workplace experience is that you're offering, the employee experience, and making that attractive, sustainable, supportive, and that is a continuous feedback loop, as you can see here, where by bringing together or considering together, should I say, the training activities or opportunities that you make available, how you're monitoring or performance and productivity, and ensuring that is joined up with any other activities that you're doing in terms of engagement, and being able to focus on individualizing that, personalizing that experience for people, opening up the doors so that they can confidently and safely express what they do know and what they don't know, so that the improvement can happen in a timely fashion. So this is all a continuous mechanism, and it's important that I guess the infrastructure that you have, the processes, but also the technology, and also the way in which an HR function inside an organization is structured, it is about alignment. It's not about just thinking about those things in separate siloed ways, which is still very common. And I think that needs to be challenged, that thought, so that you can think more holistically, align those elements, and that way you start to expose the talent that already is there. You can develop the talent that you already have, and do that in a fashion that keeps people motivated. They stay motivated and engaged. Yeah, that's our vision, I think, to collectively for us all, as in whatever organization we might find ourselves in. I'm sure you'll be, if you think about your own organization, you'll see that there are broken elements in that loop, which could be improved if if you did change that mindset somewhat and structure.
Yeah, and the piece that it hits for me is when you talk about it isn't just being engaged, being aligned, and I think that's so critical. And we've seen it in actually on our research. We did a survey and a study around what goes into the learning experience, the learner experience itself, and we found that companies who say that their approach is having a positive impact on outcomes like employee engagement and individual performance, time to productivity, all of these different outcomes, we found that they were far more likely to provide things like they would let learners know what the link was between the learning and their particular path, like here's why you're seeing this. They would also provide the goals and outcomes expected, so they knew that this is what the organization is hoping to achieve through this, which sounds very basic, but the reality is a lot of times learning functions will create the learning, and they'll put a lot of time and effort in it and make it very, from in their minds, very engaging, but just sort of put it out there. And people are expected to think that, yes, I'm seeing this because it matters to me, and it's by definition, it's effective and connected. But if you don't give the learners that initial what's in it for me, then you're already trying to jump this very high hurdle of engagement, right? So, but the ability to align the learning that's happening with the organization itself, its outcomes, that person's personal path, their requirements, their interests, whatever it happens to be, you've now sort of taken that huge leap towards engagement and outcomes.
Absolutely. So I think it's also important to see that really what we're trying to do here is sustain that motivation across all of our employees, and to do that we need to understand what motivates people actually in the workplace. And too often it's misguided. It's not just about reward. It's actually really about aligning three underlining things, which I guess a number of you may well be familiar with. A book that was published 10 years ago by Daniel Pink. It's called Drive, and he brought together a number of elements of research that really explored motivation in the workplace. But they could be summarized as, having the opportunity to learn and develop mastery in areas where your strengths are, and that really concurs with what we've been discussing already. Having that space and confidence to be able to exercise those skills and to engage with others and collaborate with others confidently. So there's psychological safety in the culture that of your organization to allow that. So that autonomy is there. Plus there's an alignment between the purpose of that organization and, if you're an employee, that's why you're working for them, that you feel personally motivated and aligned with that. And if that's achieved, if all three of those elements are supported successfully, it's a bit like three legs of a stool. If one of them's missing, the whole thing falls over. If they're aligned properly, then huge benefits can be gained, I think, in terms of productivity, in terms of talent retention, talent development, and all of that will just move the organization forward as a whole. And it will be more resilient, and it will be more adaptable as well in the face of all sorts of unknown change ahead. So what does that mean, though, in terms of the infrastructure that you have in your organizations? Well, I think typically all of those three things, whether it's performance management, engagement, learning management, all of those three things are typically sort of managed separately. They're not aligned and not giving that that workplace experience or that talent experience. They're not delivering that in a way that is congruent and aligned with what people are experiencing to support their day-to-day work. Too often it steps on its own toes, and you end up frustrating people or slowing people down. It adds friction into their day as opposed to removing it. So that's very much what I think we're certainly here at Totara, that's something that we're very focused on, is to see if there's ways to provide platforms that are removing that friction and that will encourage that that approach, that more aligned approach. So one way of looking at this, and it's sort of a nice way of looking at it, I think, is to summarize, I guess, the direction we're all heading in, which is a world which is more uncertain. It does require more agility and adaptiveness or adaptability. And to do that, you can sort of characterize your organization in say musical terms sometimes. So many organizations perhaps are sort of classical in structure, i.e. there's a strong hierarchy. You've got a clear conductor who is giving you a set of operational procedures and processes which you abide by, a fixed score, shall we say, and then you perform accordingly in quite known and well documented and no deviation from that. But that sort of model doesn't work so well when you get shocks like we've had. That rigidity and that brittleness becomes challenging. So if your organization was more like a jazz ensemble where you are working together, there is a constant real-time sort of feedback mechanism between all the players. No one person is necessarily leading or in charge often, and any one of you can go off and improvise at any point, and others adapt around you. So that sort of type of thinking perhaps fits better for the future, where shocks arrive. How does your organization respond to that? Do you have that adaptability? Do you have that a way of collaborating that is slightly loosely coupled, but also is built upon expertise that is both deep and broad and flexible enough? So the role of building skills that enable people to operate in that way and confidently feels to me that those organizations that can do that are far more likely to be successful in this rapid change and dynamic of the world that we now live in.
So let's take a minute and maybe you can let us know how do you think your organization approaches these things. And the poll just closed on me before I had it open. Melissa, if you add it again real quick, maybe I can relaunch it. But we were gonna get a sense from the group where your organization might be in terms of the type of based on what Lars is just describing. And if you want, you can put some comments and or feedback into the question box, and we can take a look at that. But the tool, for some reason, closed the poll before anyone actually took part in it, Lars. So, but just something to think about. See what's going on within your own organization. And as we move forward here, let's bring it all back together with the disruptors and how that fits into all these other elements.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the concept of adaptability, I think, can be summarized as moving our corporate cultures away from a culture of compliance more to one where there is distributed decision making and a culture which actually does have much more mutual trust sewn the way through it. If you end up in that type of environment, collaboration is essential, isn't it, to that? You can't not have that sense of collaboration. It's the thing that makes that work effectively. But that's also what will lie at the heart of being a much more innovative organization and being able to remain competitive going forward. So these 5 disruptors, there are additional elements to this that we describe in an ebook, which you're free to download. The URL is there on the screen. But essentially, in order to build that better workplace, to be resilient, adaptability is critical. And in order to do that, the technology that we're sewing into our organizations and putting into our organizations needs to be flexible. It needs to integrate. It needs to be an ecosystem of tools and that will not just be right for the next 6 months, but is something that you can adapt and it can be flexible in the light of changes, business needs in business needs that you're facing. So that gives, I think, that adaptability operates inside people. It operates in terms of the structure of the organization, and then that structure is bound together by the technology that it deploys across it. And if any of those elements isn't flexible, it's therefore brittle, and if it's brittle, then it breaks under any stress. And the future is full of 180 turns. I think for people, they'll be needing to rethink their business models on a far more frequent basis than they've ever done before. So yeah, I'd encourage people to take a closer look at this when they get an opportunity.
Yeah. All right, so we do have some questions that came in, and I wanted to make sure we took this last bit of time, this 10 minutes or so, because there's some pretty good questions. I will say that people were chiming in on the type of organization, and we saw people saying that they're moving from classical to jazz, and they're doing it rather quickly, and also classical and trying to change and feeling a bit pushed in that direction. So that's what we would assume to see, is that a lot of organizations are trying to make that shift to that type of approach. So I have a nice, I think, a very deep question here. I'll throw out, and Erin's wondering, she's wondering about complexity consciousness in organizations, right? So how can we support employees to function successfully as the systems and the organization become increasingly complex at an increasing velocity? Do you have any thoughts on that? It's a pretty deep question, but.
That's a great question, because if you unpick the complexity, often our organizations are unnecessarily complex. So there's complexity, which is almost like the fossilization of just the way we've done things, and you start to forget why it was there, and it becomes calcified, and that's challenging. And that complexity is something that can be needs to be addressed. It needs to be looked at afresh, and you can often find simpler routes through if you're willing to knock those things down. However, I think the direction of travel, which I think the question is really talking to, is that things are all our products, our services, there is increasing complexity in order to deliver those things out to our customers and etc. And that creates a learning challenge, doesn't it? To be able to understand those things and be able to evolve them accordingly. So for me, I think it's getting the, first of all, getting the basics right, so that you've got the right infrastructure in place and the right tools available to you to enable people to learn at a more faster pace. And when I say faster, more effective manner. Yeah. So that talks to the intentional learning culture that I alluded to before when we were talking to that. But the other aspect of this is that technology's impact on that complexity, is growing, but it's also solving it. So when you look at the increased use of AI tools and machine learning, sort of automating of processes, that robotic process automation, RPA, all of that is having a dramatic effect, I think, in almost black boxing to the human that complexity. And instead, what we need to understand is what those tools are doing, and so that we can ensure that we understand them and that we can improve them in the right ways. So I think there's this double-edged element to this, so you want to be the right side of it as an individual person, being able to understand it. And I think that's a big part of that skills transition and challenge, is understanding that impact on yourself and also the organization.
Yeah, it's a balancing act, right? There's always unintended consequences for things, and I think of technology a lot of times. If you think over the course of your own life, how many times you've been told that this bit of technology is going to save you X amount of time. By now you should have, just hours and hours of free time to yourself. But that never is the case, right? It's everything that solves something sometimes comes with its own little piece of complexity. So it's figuring out that balancing act for sure, the way you were describing, Lars. All right, so another question that came in. This is a very specific one of you, and I swear this is an organic question that came in. But was curious about how, we've talked a lot of theory and concept and research around teams and collaboration. Your specific experience, with the Engage tool, you don't have to name a client, or just give some use case examples, or just an example of how Engage is supporting this type of team collaboration. Someone who's just curious to know that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that it can come about. It's taking a more holistic approach to the learning design. So having being able to supplement the formal curricula of learning that will be there to support particular job roles and development paths for your organization, and then to supplement that with an active peer-to-peer opportunity to create your own learning content, curate your own learning content, and to share that and to start solving problems and align that to an action learning problem. So in our tool sets, we have concepts such as workspaces. You can form a workspace around a team or group, and you can join that around a common set of interests, and material is then shared through that collaborative experience. And so by doing that, you're exposing to others and helping them solve problems across the normal silos of the organization. So, and you're also, through the process of some of the analytics and reporting on it that shows what's more popular, you can surface and recommend materials that have been proved to be successfully used by others, and it can therefore accelerate the rate at which better solutions and better answers to problems get utilized. So you're shifting the learning experience from being passive to being much more active as a result. Yeah. And then just one other quick flavor of that is where you take a social learning first model, and we've got an organization that's done that, where they've reached down into their organization. It's one that's sort of bar and restaurant sort of chain, or multiple chains and brands, and what they've done is create a social first. It's all about sharing your own experience in the particular bar or restaurant that you're in, and asking questions of each other, and it's peer-to-peer learning first, interjected with formal opportunities. So when they surface up and they ask these questions, the formal opportunities follow it. And that's interesting because it's all motivation led then.
Right.
It's not the company or the organization imposing a whole curricular of things that I have to do, and that feels like school, it feels like and it still is often the experience that we have. But the other way around is where I'm asking questions, I'm getting them answered, I'm solving other people's problems, and other people are coming back to me and offering me opportunities to deepen my knowledge and in areas that I'm already showing an interest in. Either it's a performance support issue, or it's a more of a developmental opportunity. So there's a couple of ways in which I think bringing together the formal learning aspect of things, and then offering a highly collaborative, easy to collaborate tool set as well. Joining those two together is really powerful.
Yeah, and I think one of the key parts of that is a tool like that, like Engage, is it's not just that you're allowing people to collaborate in the sense that they can ask each other questions, which is a great thing, but it's, look, people are going to ask each other questions anyway, right? They're already doing that. Whether you've got a platform that allows them to do it, they're figuring out how they can get information from one another. So the key is, okay, do I have a tool that allows them to do that very easily, and also allows other people to learn from those interactions, whereas one person asks a question, another one answers it. It isn't just those two people who are benefiting, right? It's everybody can benefit. And
it is.
Yeah, and going one step further too, the ability for people to really share their knowledge by creating content, not simply answering questions, but actually creating content and being able to share that is critical. I think for some reason, a lot of organizations are afraid to unlock the knowledge that exists in their workforce, and they keep people sort of locked up with what they can and can't say or do or share. But the idea is, if you can give people tools that say, look, here's how I solve this problem, and I can shoot a quick video, I can make a quick little click through for it, a PDF, whatever it happens to be, and then share that out to people, and then people can, reshare it, can comment on it, can do whatever. That's what their collaborative learning is all about. So you need to look for tools that allow more than just, hey, how you doing? Or let me like your post, but actually be able to create things that are very useful to the whole organization.
Absolutely,
Yep.
and it creates a very useful feedback loop for the L&D teams as well, where you start to see things that aren't covered in the more formal curricula, and you can spot it, you can co-opt that material and maybe formalize it, because it would benefit from that, and bring it into the onboarding materials of a particular job role, for example, and spread it out right across the organization, rather than it just being discoverable. But yeah, that closing of the loop of people exposing how people can problem solve, and then spreading the results of that out to the wider organization almost immediately, it has a huge benefit to especially to larger organizations who are typically struggle with that knowledge dissemination.
Right, and it'll also help you identify knowledge centers and skill areas in the organization that perhaps no one knew existed. If someone becomes an expert and is helping everybody with this one area, no one may have known that person was the expert, but that can surface in a system like that.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, we've gone just a little, about a minute over or so. I really appreciate everyone asking questions and joining us today. Thank you so much to Totara for giving us the hour, and of course, Lars, your time as well and your insights. I appreciate it very much. Thanks to everyone for joining. And so Lars, any last words or just a thanks?
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for your time and attention. I'd welcome any contact you'd like to make with myself or my colleagues, and we can tell you a bit more about what we're doing. But best of luck, everyone. It's tough out there. I appreciate that. So thank you, and good luck.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and stay safe.